So once again, we are here with Aaron Brailsford from F5 SIRT, and we're here to talk about the month in security. So Aaron, welcome. How you doing today?
Hey, I'm good. Thanks for having me back, Aubrey.
It's great to have you back. Always glad to have you. So can you, before we kind of get into the latest news, can you tell me a little bit about what it is you do for F5 and what SIRT does?
Absolutely. So my team does two things outside of education, like This Week in Security and DevCentral posts. We look after vulnerability response for all F5 products. So we handle disclosure of vulnerabilities in F5 code and in third-party code that we consume. And we also help out customers who come under attack. So any customer who's suffering from some kind of security emergency can just phone into the support organization. If they say they're under attack, that kicks off a process within F5 that pulls the SIRT into that engagement. And we will do basically anything we can to stop the bleeding, get customers back up and running, provide advice on how they might want to handle an incident, and then join them up with their account teams if there are products that might better suit them in the long term.
Fantastic. That's actually very timely information for most of our customers. Of course, coming up on August 3rd, if you don't know, we do have our quarterly security notifications coming out, which is an agreed scheduling for us to release our CVEs. So definitely keep CERT in mind if there are any CVEs which are impacting you and which you need help mitigating. Now, with that kind of out there, I guess if we could jump into the news. Aaron, what do you got for me?
Yeah, exactly. So over the last month, there's been a lot going on in the InfoSec world, as there always is. And I thought I'd pull out just a few things that we talked about in the This Week in Security articles, a few things that were interesting or stood out to me. Back around June 6th-ish, there were two new processor vulnerabilities that were disclosed. One was called Hertz Bleed, and the other was called Ret Bleed. I thought they were interesting to talk about. Right, they're another in a long line of processor vulnerabilities that started really with Spectrum Meltdown, right, a few years ago. If you remember those.
I don't actually.
There's a whole class of processor vulnerabilities that are kind of interesting. Spectrum Meltdown were the first, and they deal with side channels that you can create to leak information out of what should be protected areas of memory using things called speculative execution. It's a technique that modern processors use to be able to predict what branches need to be executed in code, right? In code, you always have lots of conditional branching happening. Modern processors don't really start at the top of a program and just execute every instruction in sequence, right? That's how processors worked in the 80s and 90s until sort of the Pentium, at least in x86, till the Pentium came along. From that point in time, they started to batch instructions up and try and basically race the processor ahead of where the program is, if you like. So you're always trying to execute as much as you can in parallel and as far ahead as you can in the program. And sometimes that means you're operating on either information that you might not actually have yet, or branches where you don't actually know which branch you should take. And processors use a variety of techniques to try and predict what the information is they should be working on, essentially the outcome of a calculation before you've done the calculation, or what branches they might have to take in code. That's what gives us a massive speed boost in modern processors over older processors.
Okay.
But it comes with some penalties. If you can trick a processor into taking a branch that it might not otherwise have taken, you can cause it to leak some information. And that was what Spectrum Meltdown were all about. And people have been building off that research ever since. There's been I couldn't even tell you how many different processor vulnerabilities have come out since then. And these were the last two. So Heartsbleed was a little different in that the side channel here is basically how fast the processor is running, the clock speed. So most modern processors, I would go as far as to say all, but at least Intel, AMD, and ARM will scale their clock speeds up and down depending on what the workload is they're working on, right? If they're idle, they can scale the clock speed right back to save power. And if they're running flat out, many of them, all of the current Intel and AMD processors support like a turbo boost speed, right? So they'll overclock themselves up when they're running flat out.
Okay.
And the researchers for Heartsbleed discovered that if you could make the processor run on known workloads, essentially, you could make it scale its processor speed up and down, measure how long it took for your workloads to happen, and from that infer what data it was operating on. They used that to leak private keys that should otherwise not have been recoverable.
Wow.
And this sounds, it sounds really bad, right? And when we had Spectrum Meltdown, there was a ton of panic around processor vulnerabilities and CPU vulnerabilities. Because what do you do about that, right? It's the core of the computer. If that's vulnerable, then all bets are off, right?
Yeah, I would think that any programming interface would have the ability to impact that, or language for that matter.
Exactly. It's the core of everything is vulnerable to something. The reality is, and I talked about this in This Week in Security, because this was the one that I wrote. The reality is that in most situations, you probably are not impacted enough for this to be a significant consideration. There are certainly for Heartsbleed, there are far, far easier ways that an adversary would look to compromise a system than using this. So while the researchers showed that theoretically this is exploitable across the internet, there was a whole slew of things that they needed to do first, like you needed a vulnerable piece of code that you can run on the target device. So you've already achieved some kind of compromise. And really the most impacted environments here are likely to be cloud providers or virtual infrastructure where you have a single CPU shared across a number of systems. But if you're not running untrusted workloads, and realistically, even if you take the example of a BigIP that could be servicing thousands, tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of concurrent users, trying to observe any kind of timing change based on the input, you're relying on the timing changes being specific to your input. But if there's a couple of 100,000 people concurrently using the service, the likelihood is that will have a bigger impact on the timing changes. So the chances of that being exploitable in the real world, I would hesitate to say slim to none, but I think most of us have more important things to worry about. These are great pieces of research, and I'm glad people are doing them, and they shouldn't stop because it informs future processor design. But at least in my view, they are more academic exercises than anything else.
So are these exploits things that processors in some of our systems could be impacted by, or is this something that we might have to look out for in virtual editions, something like that?
So both of those are true. Heartsbleed affects basically every Intel and AMD processor that's on the market today, a large number of ARM ones. There are workarounds available, and the workaround for Heartsbleed at least is you disable frequency scaling. If you lock the processor at its regular frequency, right, so not scaled down and not in turbo boost, then you lose that side channel completely. You can't influence its clock speed in any way, so everything will always take the same amount of time to compute regardless of the workload. The cost there obviously is in power consumption, because You will always have the regular amount of power consumption. It can never scale itself back. And you lose that turbo boost. So if you were relying on that extra capacity to keep your infrastructure running, you would lose that. For BigIP hardware platforms, we don't recommend any of the workarounds, and I don't believe we support the workarounds because the exposure of this is so theoretical and limited. The cost of the workaround vastly outweighs the risk of the vulnerability existing. And in shared infrastructure, so for virtual machines or cloud instances, it's up to the people administering that shared infrastructure, right? You could put the workarounds in place. Personally, I think the cost outweighs the benefits.
So just a curiosity for me personally, as I hear you talk about this, I'm wondering whether or not specialized coprocessors like QAT would also be vulnerable to these, or if maybe offloaded workloads might be a little less impacted by these vulnerabilities.
Yeah, it's a good point. So certainly in an environment like the BigIP, in a BigIP with, say, a crypto card, right, a lot of the cryptographic operations, which is specifically what the Hertzbleed researchers were looking at, is handled in a hardware system.
Yeah.
Which should have fixed timings, right? That as a vulnerability in cryptography has been long known about, right? Everything needs to be timing predictable. So yeah, your risk is greatly diminished. In terms of virtual editions, you could be using a NetHSM, say, for some of the crypto operations, but you'll probably be CPU bound for everything else. There isn't much research into that angle, I don't think.
Yeah, that would be interesting if there were. Of course, we at F5 tend to believe in offloading your SSL. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Anything else about these couple of processor vulnerabilities?
Yeah, one other thing I would mention, there was another vulnerability came up, which is called Pacman. It's another vulnerability with a shiny name and logo. It's another processor vulnerability. This one was interesting and I think unique because it affects the new Mac M1 processor. All of the research I've seen to date has been x86, right? So Intel and AMD, or ARM, a classic ARM. I know M1 Mac has its roots in ARM. This I won't talk about at length, but for me falls into much the same bucket as Hertzbleed. Is it exploitable in the real world? Yes, probably. Do I think attackers are actually going to exploit this in the real world? No, probably not. You needed a vulnerable kernel module to already be loaded on the target system. So the researchers wrote their own. And in the real world, that's not going to exist, right? You've also got to find a piece of pre-existing vulnerable kernel code to exploit. Does that mean that it doesn't exist? No, it could well do. And, if there was a kind of attacker that I thought would use this attack surface, it would be nation states. Your regular run-of-the-mill attacker is going to deliver you a piece of malware in some other way, right? Like a drive-by download or a phishing attack. It's always phishing. They're not going to go looking for processor vulnerabilities, but they also have to find a vulnerable kernel module first.
Well, it's like you said, there are easier ways to skin that cat for the average hacker.
Very much so. And that kind of leads me on to the next thing that stood out to me over the last month. We talked a lot about esoteric processor vulnerabilities just now, but most often attacks are carried out against the human targets, right? So phishing or stolen credentials. And there was a piece that Megazone put in his This Week in Security, which was that there are now 24 billion username and password combinations floating around on the dark web.
Wow.
Which is just a staggering number. It's a staggering amount of personal information, usernames and passwords available for purchase and use, right? We also saw research around the June 27th issue of This Week in Security about how you could leak access tokens from Amazon Photos. It's quite a specific attack, but they kind of interleave together. they really come back to two things for me, which is why second factor auth is so hugely important, and the fact that we continue to see, and I think we will continue to see, an enormous amount of brute force and credential stuffing attacks against targets. That's something we help customers with a lot. We have great products to help with that, and because it comes up so often.
Now, is there anything that you guys are seeing with BigIPs or with F5 customers today where they are impacted by these specific? Well, I mean, obviously, our customers are going to be impacted by the 24 billion usernames and passwords, but the Amazon exploit specifically, is that something that we've seen insert with our customers, or is that just more general?
Yeah, no, that one is more theoretical, I think. I mean, it is a risk and it was proven, but it's not something that we've seen. What we have seen, I think, is a swing from brute force attacks against form-based authentication, right? Your typical website that's aimed at, an end user in a browser, to attacks against API endpoints being the predominant vector. Often mobile application endpoints, and I think attackers choose that because they're a more difficult thing to protect. Obviously, some of the technologies that you would classically rely on to protect form-based auth, so insertion of JavaScript, looking to see whether the user is a real human, right, with either captures or advanced WAF has had this for a number of years, like the human user interaction JavaScript that looks for things like mouse movements and patterns of typing on keyboard, that kind of stuff. All of that goes out of the window when it's an API endpoint that a mobile app is using. We do have great solutions for that in F5, right? We have mobile SDKs as part of distributed cloud Shape that you can deploy. Yep. And those are brilliant. And we continue to get calls from people who have not deployed that kind of technology yet, who need to protect themselves against these attacks.
It's funny. I spent a little bit of time on the distributed cloud team, and one of those things that we would see every now and again would be, someone who needed to get that sort of protection up fast because they knew that they were under attack, but they didn't know how to patch that hole quick. When you're in a big organization, you have to go through the procurement process, and many times, there aren't a lot of vice presidents and such that want to okay spending on products that are untested in the environment and whatnot. So it was nice for us to be able to say, hey, well, we've got these proven technologies. We've got the same WAF engine that's in AWAF. A lot of our customers are already used to that. And we've got Shape that's available to us on the distributed cloud. We can put up an Anycast VIP in 2 minutes and defend you from all of that. It is comfortable to be able to talk to customers, especially in financial services markets. I found when you have a fixer that's that quick.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's brilliant being able to spin something like that up quickly. And one of the things we end up doing a lot in the CERT with customers who are under attack is getting them a stopgap, right? Because quickly still involves some discussion, generally speaking. We'll often be working with people just looking at the requests to look for things we can key off to differentiate valid from invalid. And then deploying usually I rules that are looking for something quite specific, knowing full well that this is a game of whack-a-mole we're entering into, right? But it's a game of whack-a-mole that should end when something like Shape has been actually integrated and spun up. So you can live with that pain for a short period of time. Yeah, we run into that an awful lot.
So it would appear that, we're seeing more and more these days of credential stuffing attacks and a whole lot of stolen credentials, as you mentioned, with all those millions of usernames and passwords out there. What is kind of the best recommendation for defense out there right now?
It's a good question. And alongside deploying something like Shape's mobile SDK, if you've got mobile app, advanced WAFs, human user detection, if you've got regular form-based login, a second factor of authentication, right? If you haven't deployed 2FA or MFA in some form, everywhere should have it. Even text messaging, right? We know that there are risks associated with SMS as a second factor because there's the risk of SIM swap attacks, which that risk varies wildly depending on geography. So where I am in the UK, SIM swapping is considerably harder, as I found to my cost when I legitimately needed to SIM swap and had to jump through a whole bunch of hoops.
Yeah, and I'm assuming you saw how Malibot handled the multi-factor authentication as well. That was pretty exciting. I mean, to be able to take control of the end user device is pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nothing is infallible, and to defeat 2FA, then since it's mostly done through mobile phones, right? None of us carry RSA tokens around anymore.
I have a collection.
I had one until I was going to say I did have one until recently. Some of the banks in the UK, I don't know if you have these in the US, they use a device called Pin Sentry. So it's like a tiny, looks like a desktop calculator, but you put your debit card into it and it interfaces with the chip on the card, right? That's to give you an RSA-alike sort of number. That obviously can't be controlled by malware like Malibot because it's a physical device that is not connected to the internet. You could still fish for the second factor, right? You could still, and this is a common thing, phone people up, pretend to be the bank, ask someone to use their Pin Sentry device and, attack it that way.
The possibilities are endless, right?
It's infinitely better. Exactly. The people sitting at the end of the keyboard or the telephone are always the easiest thing to attack, and they are always fallible. We are all human, and to err is human, as they say. So everything can be defeated, but a second factor of authentication, it should be on every single login form and functionality everywhere at this point.
You said everything can be defeated. One of those things that seems to have been defeated recently has been the global supply chain, right? So my understanding is you guys have got some intriguing updates there as well.
Yeah. So actually, in the most recent This Week in Security, one of my colleagues, Kyle, talked about the hardware supply chain and how that's being disrupted right now. Some components are just ridiculously hard to get hold of, and that affects everybody, right? It affects us just as much as it affects other companies. And F5, we've been working hard to try and design out those constraints, right? We leverage our buying power where we can. And like everybody else, if we can redesign hardware to remove the problematic component, then we will. That's probably easier in the circumstances Carl was talking about, which is badges for DEF CON, because these are, this is essentially guerrilla development, right? These are small teams of rapidly developing hardware, unlike F5, where we're much bigger and we have much longer lead times on our development cycles. But we can apply the same principles. The hardware supply chain is something we don't talk about often, but is very important. More oftenly, we're talking about software supply chain. And I seem to end up talking about this every time I write This Week in Security, almost as often as I talk about weird processor vulnerabilities. So back in early June, I wrote about QNAP NASes. They were targeted, they've been targeted a number of times, but they were targeted most recently by a couple of specific kinds of malware that look to encrypt and lock away your files. And it was, nobody was sure how that malware was delivered. But to me, it seemed really suspiciously coincidental that very soon after that, like a number of days after that was disclosed or started happening, they disclosed their vulnerability to and published fixes for a PHP CVE from 2019. So the likelihood is this is an old vulnerability that's been lurking in their software supply chain for a couple of years, 3 years now. And people who had their QNAPs exposed to the internet, because they do like cloud publishing of files and stuff, were getting popped through this thing that had been just sitting there lurking. That is a problem for everybody. Again, it's something that impacts F5 as well, and something that all vendors are putting a good deal of money and time into trying to solve. There was the whole software bill of materials mandated by the executive order recently in the US, and I think that's going to drive a lot of positive change. It's not just a problem that's unique to your software products if you're a vendor, right? As a consumer, you have a supply chain that includes your vendors, and actually trying to manage that for consumers is very, very difficult. We can look at Atlassian, who had a CVE that in early June had mass exploitation. They were subject to a CISA warning in the US to immediately patch, any affected infrastructure.
We just talked about that on DevCentral Connect yesterday. Boo and I did. They had another couple of vulnerabilities that were released. I saw, one in questions. It seems like, that had a hard-coded password even. I mean, I haven't seen that kind of thing in a while, but, for a one-off account, I guess maybe it makes sense. But to have that as a default and active on I don't know. To me, that whole idea spoke to, boy, it must be nice to have, cloud, cloud SaaS components to your infrastructure these days, rather than on-prem. That was a scary one for me.
Yeah, that hard-coded username. I was about to say I'm going to pick on them again because I was going to bring that up exactly. That's a howler. I mean, none of us are perfect, right? And that's probably something that, if we're being generous here, a junior developer maybe didn't think about the consequences, was missed in a threat model assessment, and it wound up in a product. I mean, it
reminded me, and I have to bring this one up, of when I was a junior admin, actually, way back in like 2001, 2002, we had a virtual mail appliance that came with a root password blanked out. And that was exposed on the management interface. So, like, oh my gosh. I mean, and you could we exploited it in front of the vendor at one point. We said, look, just watch, shared a screen and said, here we go. We, SSH to the to the management interface, typed in root, hit enter, and then password, hit enter, on full access. Like, what? And it was this was a mail platform that it was scary to know how many people actually used that thing too. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'll hold our hand up and say that we're not perfect, and we haven't been perfect in the past. It's not until relatively recently that we mandated changing the root and admin user passwords on a BigIP, right? And that historically has caught a good number of people out. Thankfully, that's changed, and we force, a password being changed, and I think on the latest versions we enforce some kind of a password policy by default, which is also nice. Incredibly frustrating in a lab environment, but much better in a production environment. But yeah, those kind of gotchas, I mean, they will continue to crop up from time to time. Everybody is fallible, like we've said a number of times so far.
All human.
Yeah, exactly. The most frightening part of the supply chain problem, in terms of security for me, rather than in terms of simply being able to procure hardware in the first place, and the difficulties of actually understanding the threat landscape in a product, which is a huge problem. The most worrying part for me is what if hardware you buy comes pre-compromised? Yeah. This week, I think it was this week, Kaspersky and an ex-Kaspersky employee published a bunch of research around a UEFI or UEFI rootkit. And the bit that jumped out to me in that research, I'm sure we can include a link to it in the video description, but the bit that jumped out to me was that this relatively complex rootkit that was well thought out and seemed to be, well appointed in terms of features and functionality. Nobody's determined how it gets on there in the first place, right? It's essentially it's a hardware level rootkit, right? That's infecting the UEFI bootloader. It seems to have always been found on one of two makes of motherboard with one chipset. Now, we've had panic and speculation previously, right, about a particular chipset manufacturer or a particular board manufacturer having been compromised at source. And I don't want to I don't want to kick off that kind of speculation, but there's something common with what they've found there. And if you can't find, maybe it's just that we haven't yet found how it got on there, but it seems suspicious to me.
It's funny. Hardware exploits in general are something I think that, your average security folks don't tend to think about. My last interaction with SIRT and one of my customers while I was still in sales, we were looking at a customer's BigIP that had been compromised by a particularly nasty CVE. And while we were digging through it, we saw a component in this in the kit. We were able to find an egg drop bot that was sitting there and that was utilized in the compromise. And in that kit, we saw something that CERT believed was being used to try to hard write code onto the crypto chip of the BigIP in specific, so that even if you rebooted it, as soon as the crypto chip came back up, it would reinfect the BigIP to be able to use it for crypto mining. So ultimately, the CERT recommendation at that time was to send the BigIP back, and we issued an RMA, and the customer had a new system. So that was the first time I really had to think about it and went, oh my gosh, that's a persistent threat,
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and it's the BigIPs have one or more FPGAs in almost all of the models now, if not all of them. And those FPGAs have code which can be updated because they're
flashed
programmable gate arrays, right? And we put a lot of protections in. Yeah, we put a lot of protections into that process to ensure that we're only writing, known code, that checksums out okay. The boxes have a health check when they boot. But there is always the possibility of, if you can get something in like a rootkit that could then manipulate those health checks, right? It's how do you, if a device has been potentially compromised, proving that you're at a known good state is remarkably difficult. And for that reason, we build, like I say, a ton of protections into the processes that flash the FPGAs, the processes that validate them, to make sure that they can't be compromised in the first instance, or to try to. I'm pretty sure I remember the incident you're talking about there, and that was the first and I think only time we've seen that, which is good, because hopefully it means that, the risk is small. And off the back of that, we made, code changes and procedural changes to limit the risk further. But yeah, if your hardware gets popped, if you take the UEFI bootloader, if the bootloader gets popped, and let's say it's a Windows laptop, none of Windows's protection mechanisms are going to function here, because you're in before any of those instantiate.
It makes me wonder how the Open Programmable Interface project will impact some of the ability for this kind of, hardware threat to persist. I wonder if it will make it easier to sort out, or whether it will make it kind of more common. I think we assumed that with Linux, for instance, in terms of OSs, that it would be harder to have exploits, because everyone has eyes on that code. But there's so much code, so it's like there's so much code out there. So maybe it's also easier to put in something esoteric that may be missed.
Oh yeah, it's so we'll digress a little bit into this, I guess, but two things that spring to mind there. One is that a lot of the security around commercial products, not so much as we're pretty open about our security posture, but certainly if you take Intel with some of their lights out management stuff that's on processors, security through obscurity is what ruled there, right? It wasn't, we didn't believe it was exploited because nobody even knew it existed or how it operated. And it had to be reverse engineered before people could find the problems that would demonstrate the exploits. There's also the assumption, like you say, that if everybody's got eyes on the code, then vulnerabilities couldn't possibly exist because someone will spot them. I know there's been some research papers into whether that really pans out, or whether actually what you have is a whole load of very big projects with very small numbers of active contributors, people who are actually looking at the code. And mostly what you've got is people who are just blindly consuming it, because how can you possibly audit 300 million lines of code as a consumer?
Not at all. Well, I'm sure we could go on forever about about this, but we have nothing left to talk about next month. So I guess unless you have any other parting thoughts, Aaron, I figure we could wrap for the month.
Absolutely. And we'll do it again next month.
I look forward to it. Well, let's keep in touch, and then we will definitely make sure that we keep our community up to date on the month in security. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Aubrey King from DevCentral.